I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Alex Cruse, who's coming all the way from Oakland, and who is going on the bike, and who is going to have no slides, but a talk about that's based on the Pedagogy Committee of FemTechNet, an international collaboration of scholars and activists working at the nexus of feminism and technology. And that is very exciting to me. We just had a discussion about this matter because we were looking at the concept of grace versus knowledge. And we were thinking, there was a speaker here recently who spoke about the importance of grace as a more feminine construct of knowledge, and the importance of knowledge as a more masculine construct, and the notion of epistemophilia. Have you ever heard that one?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, you'll take it in a totally different direction, but please welcome Alex Cruse.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody for coming. So the paper that I'm presenting is talking about the dialogue between opacity and transparency across architecture, computation, and art. This paper introduces what I refer to as transparency aesthetics in both architectural and social capacities. It will attempt to parse the symbology of architecture in technological corporate realms, of opaque, secretive data centers and tech industrial zones, which operate in the background of pseudo-open communications channels. These concepts implicate Alexander Galloway's investigations of black box architecture, as well as Keller Easterling's writings on extra-state craft and special economic zones. This paper observes the black box alongside the concomitant architectural programs of the technology industry, which employ aesthetic symbols of transparency, infinity, and recursion. Such motifs include highly reflective surfaces that appear to explode beyond their material borders. Here we see metonyms for screen-based culture and of a repetition of forms that allude to the feedback loop of economic and affective activity performed in digital space, as well as the formalism of capital in guises both concrete and intangible. I posit that there is an evolving dialogue between discriminatory digital practices aimed at non-normative identities that continue to render certain users, most notably feminists, transgender individuals, and women of color, less visible, and the genealogies of corporate architecture and of data centers, which continue to subsume the physical records and traces of a population's digital life. In this way, the mechanics of obstruction, opacity, and discretion are made manifest at the political, economic, and architectural levels. I would also like to address the relationship between transparency aesthetics within the built environment and the increasing transmateriality of digital interfaces within contemporary art, using minimalist James Turrell's Gansfeld as a case study. Many artists yield to the ubiquity of networked life, but it is Turrell's unique suppression of it which alloys Gansfeld to the logics of transparency aesthetics. As the porosity of the borders separating actor, interface, and audience grows, given the immersive quality of emergent ICT infrastructure and the increasingly mimetic capabilities of the devices it connects, the production and curation of the self undergo a conceptual turn. The selfie and the micro-documentation of the everyday syncretically produce a new, highly contentious ecology of self-representation. The transparency of the technology, its very seamlessness within the social landscape, enables a hyper-extensivity of the subject not before seen in mass culture. As the aforementioned tech-enabled practices of occlusion and negation calcify in contemporary life, so do we develop new ways of rendering each other visible, and the stakes of legibility are high. When we speak of transparency, or how it is manufactured, we necessarily imply a coextensive discourse on opacity that implicates political and economic relationships, and the intentionally impenetrable architectures of large-scale hardwares. This is coupled with the nascent reality of our communications relying upon an infrastructure that makes data vulnerable, accessible, and transparent to predatory governmental and capitalistic agencies. Alexander Galloway theorizes these relationships using the figure of the black box, a cloaked node with no external connectivity. Although already rife with connotations of secrecy and capture, Galloway extends his analysis of this symbol to include Marx's description of the commodity as being both mystical shell, or the smooth glass skin of the data center, and the rational kernel, the distributed networks that compose the global information economy. By this logic, a camera, a phone, a laptop, a building, all these are black boxes. All serve as ciphers. They realign the forces of the world according to a functional arrangement with strict prescriptions governing legibility and knowledge. This metaphor maps neatly onto the mid-20th century brutalist architectural style, the aesthetics of which also foreclose the possibility of human interfacing. Though these buildings' massive dimensions and imposing bulwarks of rough-hewn concrete reference citadels, their commissioning by companies such as AT&T presaged the importance of sheathing communications equipment, a new arsenal form for what is an increasingly discrete conflict. Currently, technological industries fabricate sites out of more fragile and reflective materials, which seem to both absorb their surrounding atmosphere and be absorbed by it. In the 21st century, we have seen the instantiation of a negative dialectic, wherein brutalism's same annulment of human inclusion and interfacing is communicated by completely transposing the architectural language of its era. Materials that signify light, ephemerality, that force lacunae into the landscape, produce sites where the logics of consumer capitalism inhere. Contemporary structures' dominant styles, panes of aquamarine glass that emerge from civic centers and reflect their environs like vertical infinity pools, or long, windowless remote data shelters, invoke seriality, or, to borrow from Rosalind Krauss, a multiplicity of near identical copies. This form also structures the object within a system in which it makes sense only in relation to other objects, objects which are themselves structured by relations of artificially produced difference. A rupture in the ontogenetic line, which naturally complements the obscurantist function of the black box itself. Across these various considerations of the black box, a singular point coheres. Its imperative is to perform a definite function, yet the parameters of that performance remain unclear. We only know inputs and outputs. This mutation has been termed by Galloway as informatic brutalism, designed to keep the information systems in and the people out. Data center exteriors and neo-modern monoliths desire not to appeal to the human, as though our human presence has already been negated, as they aestheticize our absence. One such structure, the NSA's Intelligence Community Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative Data Center, also known as the Utah Data Center, intensifies the monitoring and storage of the world's telecommunications networks. This 1 million square foot mission data repository in the city of Saratoga Springs cost $1.5 billion to construct. Its placid facade and surrounding barrenness are aggressively anti-human and belie the staggering degree of frenetic, though immaterial, activity conducted within. The implications of this become even more odious when we consider for whom is participation in the network safe, and for whom is risk involved? What types of bodies and ideologies are underrepresented in its foundational industries and overrepresented in the statistics of agencies such as the NSA? By now, we are familiar with the idea that what we can't see can be powerful. A cause needn't be defined for us to feel its effects, and the legibility of an operation is no longer linked to its materiality per se. For decades, the organizing structures that control the circulation of networks and hardwares, governments, markets, non-governmental bodies, have been developing special economic zones, a global urban form, a spatial contagion that props up what Keller Easterling calls extra statecraft, a portmanteau meaning both outside of and in addition to statecraft. Keller describes how the classic special economic zone, a sector where trade laws differ from the rest of the country, quote, begin to breed promiscuously with other enclave formats or parks, merging with offshore financial areas, tourist compounds, knowledge villages, high technology campuses, museums, and universities. Rather than functioning as catalyst and dissolving into the general business and industrial climate of its host, the zone has become a persistent yet mutable instrument, transforming as it grew and absorbing more and more of the general economy within its boundaries. As a result, many countries sought to upgrade their zones, to move from manufacturing to information technology or financial services. Similarly to the aesthetic seriality of corporate and governmental architectures, the template of the zone, and more importantly, its ability to be proliferated as an urban infrastructural design, indicate how the agendas of polity and finance are rendered as benignly transparent spatial products that ultimately conceal more insidious projects. Similarly, we continue to remake our interior worlds in accordance with architectural and visual artifacts. Yet when so much of that which is responsible for our cultural experience is generated within abstract, non-physical zones of production and distribution, such as server farms and cloud technologies, the politics of these experiences are incidentally rendered opaque. A displacement of this reality has occurred through ever-accelerating code culture, which actually assigns false eminence to the local, present, and specific. This situation invokes the dialectic of transparency aesthetics. The code which underwrites our interconnected networks and digital objects relies upon a stable temporal relay in order for that code to be executed properly. And while high-resolution screens may self-efface and confuse the barriers between the virtual and the real, they remain yoked to their rational kernel. However, the valence of digital objects and the profusion of screen-based culture illustrate the durability of the belief that we, as users, could proactively wield the digital object's mystical dimensions, that we could ever surf the network's topology in ways that work for us. Following Wendy Chun, I reject the claim that one's ability to understand and manipulate code is a liberatory gesture, but rather is integral to an authorship equals ownership paradigm that precludes engagement along lines of access and class position, which themselves are imbricated with politics of race and gender. This can be considered another vector of coding culture, which reinforces the micro-documentation of one's experiences, that being the veneration of hyper-extended mediating platforms upon which autobiography is scripted. This paradigm troubles the idea of democratized, open, and interconnected social mediation, for the singular practice of coding and constructing immaterial assemblages hierarchize the relationships of a fragmentary and technologized public. Ironically, the fight over one's representation, particularly with regard to marginalized identities, may already be lost, if it was even more than a manufactured conflict to begin with. To quote Jane Wilkinson, "Representation has a constitutive relationship with its mode of production, and such production is no longer based on a creator-apparatus-viewer relationship. It is increasingly evident that to make something or someone visible, to produce or make public from multiple sources a singular image, is not to produce or generate power. Speaking somewhat cybernetically, we, the networked masses, are what interacts with the system that binds and governs us by outputting our inputs. Through a highly sophisticated and oblique rendering of our data and spatial information, the owners/authors of the interface inadvertently accelerate processes of overdetermination and falsified representation. They enable new modes of social reproduction, whereby persons of color, women, transgender individuals, and neuroatypical persons seek connectivity on platforms which only ossify their otherness. We consign the act of self-representation to an idea of political equity, when representation itself was only ever enacted upon the field of false equivalence, which is perpetually and intentionally askew. I would now like to move from analyses of externalized to internalized interfacing. Here, we attempt, to quote Easterling, to move beyond the digital technologies to see space itself as an information system. It seems fitting, then, to include James Turrell, deemed by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art as one of the most important artists in the Southern California light and space movement. Turrell's large-scale, pseudo-interactive Gonsfeld installation, On Its Face, is a perfect inversion of Galloway's black box, though mechanistically it adheres to the same known input, unknown output axiom. To experience it, the subject occupies a semi-enclosed blank space, a screenal space, the colored background of which languidly evolves a gradient, presenting no competing aural or visual noise for the subject to filter. This exercise towards the elimination of the subject's depth perception exemplifies transparency aesthetics, not for what it enacts, but for what it prevents. Taking selfies within the exhibit is prohibited by LACMA, where Gonsfeld is housed, and presumably by Turrell himself. This intervention would upset the illusion that it is the screen which is adjusting to the subject, as opposed to the viewer focusing and mediating the space inside the screen. To suspend perception's indiscrete and liquid drift. A selfie would disrupt the techno-phenomenological line for the derealized subject, the tensile stress of the human self-image as it elongates and protracts into an indeterminate pre-individual outside, allows space for the digital to emerge. A sample, a bit, is thusly produced. Within transparency aesthetics, movement occurs without a referent or destination. It transgresses the indices of our sensorium, whether color fields, multinational infrastructures of information technology, or of capital transfer. The activation of transparency aesthetics within the built environment, within computation, or in art, commands that all functioning technologies be invisibilized in order to imbue economic and perceptual flows with their own agential quality. Hence, the stewards of extra statecraft and of the black box dilate the space of the transparently post-ideological moment. As a result, we, their hyperextended subjects, move through the extruded light of screens that have no capacity to be inscribed, experiencing our fragmentation as euphoria. Thank you. Okay. So I have a couple minutes for Q&A. Is that okay? Or if nobody has questions, that's fine.
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was very intense and beautiful. And
Thanks.
so you make us think that we are supposed to embrace our fragmentation and euphoria.
Well, I think that that is the reality. I'm not sure whether I say that has a positive valence or not.
Yeah.
I think that we have necessarily already embraced that reality, but whether we should reevaluate that relationship or not, I think is the question.
I think we should. I think we should own these aesthetics. Are there any questions in the house? Yes, yeah. Mark.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering, what is aggressively anti-human in terms of architecture? And one other thing,
yeah.
are people black boxes?
To the second.
Beautiful questions.
Yeah. To the second question, I would say absolutely, because there's no real way to register how your input is being manipulated. And we can see an output, but we're not sure of the process that underwent in the human mind. And to the first question, the aggressively anti-human reference was to data centers themselves in terms of their siting, because many of them are very remote in desert habitats where no people are really congregating and it's not really hospitable to human life.
And I think if you would approach them, you would experience intensely anti-human activity.
Exactly, yeah. More to the point, yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, please.
You mentioned Alexander Galloway's seminal contribution about black boxes,
Yeah.
and another relevant contribution came out recently, and I'm thinking about Frank Pasquale's Black Box Society. Are you familiar with this kind of take on mass surveillance and also the way, you know, reputation scores eventually impact our lives, and what you make, how would you situate these two authors?
I actually am not familiar with his work directly, sorry.
Sorry.
But I will definitely research that. Sounds great. Yeah.
No, it is just, okay, again, it goes in the same direction you were mentioning, especially in terms of this new Marxist takes on commodity as a shell, but eventually points more precisely on, well, our identity as being the commodity that is shaped by reputation scores, credit scores, and all the kind of algorithmic treatment that eventually contribute to the kind of inequality lines that you also pointed to, the fact that you can redline you can, you know, perform a very precise redlining and discrimination of some minorities and groups of people according
Absolutely.
to algorithms. So, anyway.
That's fascinating. Thank you. All right.
Yes.
Thanks.
One more? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Just wanted to make a comment. This morning, Elodie showed us why materials have to become invisible in front of certain color context, and I really appreciated the fact that you reminded us, I think you were the first one to speak about it, that transparency also has to do with an issue of social invisibility and producing invisibility through coding of color, for example. I'm just thinking of the novel The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, and you see through someone because he's black, and I always thought this very topical for our conference's question. Transparency does not necessarily mean immateriality. It can be very concrete and very...
It's a conditioned transparency.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you.
I appreciate that.
All right. Let's give Alex a round of applause.